I'm Kathy Magruder, and I'm the Executive Director of the Maryland Clean Energy Center. Today's program is Carbon Reduction Strategies and the Potential for Net Zero Emission Credits. This panel will focus on the pros and cons of adopting policy to incentivize energy generation with net zero emissions as a means to achieve climate-related goals. This is the sixth program in the Connecting to the Energy Economy speaker series, and it's made possible by the support of the sponsors listed on your screen. We'd like to take a quick moment to highlight our Voltage sponsors. First, BGE is a longtime supporter and partner of the Maryland Clean Energy Center. Schneider Electric, who is supporting this series for the first time this year and will be joining us for our final program next week. Siemens is a returning sponsor, and they will also be participating in our next week program, highlighting master energy plan design and implementation for facility maintenance and operation. And then finally, we want to give special thanks to our returning power sponsor, CohnReznick, an award-winning advisory assurance and tax firm with offices based in Bethesda. We have an awesome panel today. As a reminder, all the speakers' bios are posted online at www.mdcleanenergy.org/carbon reduction strategies. And now I'd like to introduce today's moderator. We are honored to have Senator Brian Feldman, who represents Maryland District 15 and serves as the Vice Chair of the Senate Finance Committee. Senator Feldman has been serving in the General Assembly since 2003 when he was on the House Economic Matters Committee. Among the other engagements that he participates in, those focused on energy and environment. He is a member of the Offshore Wind Business Development Advisory Committee. He is also a member of the Maryland Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Council. He serves as the Maryland representative for the Southern States Energy Board and is on the National Conference of State Legislators Task Force on Energy Supply. Good morning, Senator. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be here, Kathy. Kathy, should I just take it from here?
Yep.
To lay a little bit of a foundation. And so this is a hot topic, exciting subject that we're going to discuss today. And I thought just to lay a bit of a foundation, a few minutes, I was going to maybe just outline a little bit about where Maryland, some key places, spots where Maryland has been and where we might be heading. And then we're going to turn it over to the panelists. So just in terms of, for those of you not familiar with the legislature, the key committees in the General Assembly, essentially on the House, we've got the House Economic Matters Committee, where I used to serve when I was in the House, and the Education, Health, Environment Committee in the Senate are kind of together. And then the Environment and so let me just stop. The House committees are the Environment and Transportation Committee, and the House Economic Matters Committee have jurisdiction over most of the clean energy, environmental issues, decarbonization issues in the House of Delegates. And in the Senate, it's the so-called EHE Committee, Education, Health, Environment Committee, and my own committee of the Senate Finance Committee. And so when you go through where the state has gone legislatively, you got to maybe go back to my time in the House Economic Matters Committee, where we were the first state in the nation to actually create a renewable energy portfolio standard. That was quite a long time ago, and it set standards or goals for renewable energy in the state of Maryland. And then all the way, just going all the way to 2019, I was the sponsor of something called the Clean Energy Jobs Act in 2019, which was is designed to take us to 50% renewable energy by 2030. That piece of legislation also had other components, went a little bigger on solar power in terms of a larger solar carve-out. Offshore wind was another part of that 2019 legislation. And we also tasked the Department of Natural Resources to come up with a game plan on the feasibility of us moving at some point to 100% renewable energy in Maryland by 2024. Kathy mentioned that I serve on a couple of national boards, so I have a bit of a overview of what's happening around the United States on this subject. And then on the greenhouse gas emissions topic, back in 2009, both the House Economic Matters Committee and the Finance Committee back in '09 passed something called the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Act, which also established goals on greenhouse gas emission reductions. And that was something that was put in place, some laws, but also there, as a result of the '09 law, there were, basically some independent commissions put in place. But then later in 2015, the legislature decided to codify some of that work, and we created in the legislature the Maryland Commission on Climate Change, which is chaired by our Maryland Department of the Environment Secretary. There are work groups that are part of that, a greenhouse gas mitigation work group to develop greenhouse gas reduction recommendations. And I would make the point that those are recommendations. There's still a political legislative process in place. In 2016, the legislature updated the Greenhouse Gas Emission Reduction Act and created a 40% reduction from 2006 levels in that legislation, which was more aggressive than what the United States was looking at the time. In the Paris Accords that same year, the US had only committed to 26 to 28% by 2025 reduction. So we were more ambitious in the state of Maryland. And then you go to 2020, the commission that the Maryland Commission on Climate Change in 2020 recommended that Maryland update its recommendations to a more ambitious reduction goal of 50% by 2030 and move to net zero as early as 2045. Again, these are recommendations that were put in place, are recommended in 2020. This past year, in 2022, the General Assembly passed the Climate Solutions Act Now bill, setting a target of 60% reductions in greenhouse gas emissions by 2031 and a net zero goal for 2045. And that bill, we can talk about a little during the course of the discussion today, did a number of things. It created building energy performance standards for large buildings, 25,000 square feet and larger, created some task forces to study, make recommendations. It put in place goals for our state-owned buildings by 2035. State facilities would have to get at least 75% of their electricity from low or zero carbon sources by certain dates. Pilot programs for our schools. We've also done a lot on electric vehicles in the state of Maryland. This past year in 2022, we put a lot of investment dollars to deploy in the so-called Clean Cars Act, electrifying our state fleet of cars by 2031, light duty trucks by 2036, pilot programs for school boards who want to electrify their fleets. There were some things in that bill that were taken out at the end we can talk about. And at the end of the day here in 2021, we passed that bill. The governor did not veto the bill. He didn't sign it, became law. So looking ahead into the 2023 session and beyond, there is already pushback from some of the builders in the building community on the Climate Solutions Act bill. So I anticipate there'll be some legislation coming in 2023. The Maryland Department of Environment is tasked with coming up with a plan to get 60% reductions in place within the Climate Solutions Act law. There's a draft due June of 2023 from MDE, a final report in December of 2023. I would remind everybody that we're going to have a new governor, a new likely new secretary of the environment. We're going to have a new lieutenant governor, a new Maryland Energy Administration head, likely, potentially, a new chair of the Public Service Commission. So 2023 is going to be a year of a lot of change with key players, being different, and that's something to keep an eye on. And then we've got federal legislation that's going to have an impact on the clean energy space and all these subjects. Today, in the Senate Finance Committee, my committee, we're going to have a briefing on the Inflation Reduction Act legislation that passed this year. That's going to be at 1 o'clock. For those of you who want to stream, you could. So we'll be here in Annapolis having a hearing live, but anybody can go on the General Assembly website and watch. We're going to have a briefing on what all that huge federal money flowing into Maryland means potentially for Maryland in the clean energy space. And so with that, all that background, we've got a great panel to help guide Maryland policymakers towards that future. And we're going to have some opportunity to get some feedback and some Q&A from the audience. And I appreciate the polling questions that I think also set up for a good conversation. So we're going to start. I think that what I have in mind is we're going to have our three panelists will each take about 10 minutes, give an overview of how they see the landscape here in Maryland currently, moving ahead, what's happening trend-wise in the country, internationally. And we're going to start with Doug Vine for his 10 minutes. And again, his bio is in the chat, so I don't need to give too much here, but we have a perspective from Doug, from a think tank. We've got government represented from MEA, future panelists, and we've got industry. So we've got three great panelists here that I think are coming at this subject from very different vantage points. Doug Vine is the Director of Energy Analysis at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, works on energy decarbonization policies and technology analysis, follows trends in global and domestic energy production and utilization and their impact on greenhouse emissions. Doug, welcome. I'm going to turn it over to you to do your thing around 10 minutes, and then we'll go to the other panelists, and then we'll sprinkle in some Q&A after that. Okay, Doug, it's all yours.
Great. Thank you, Senator Feldman, and thanks to the Maryland Clean Energy Center for inviting me to speak to you here today. Thanks also for all the attendees listening in for your interest in this topic. So we can move to the next slide. Thanks. So this is the outline for my opening remarks. I'd like to just briefly introduce myself and my organization so everyone knows where I'm coming from. Then I'll talk about the decarbonization challenge, the basic plan for decarbonization, the opportunities and challenges that we face in decarbonizing the economy, and then I'll drill down a bit and look at this in the Maryland context. So again, my name is Doug Vine. I'm the Director of Energy Analysis at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, or C2ES for short. And I've been with the center now for about 10 years. My work, as the center said, largely focuses on decarbonization policies and technical analysis. So move to the next slide, please. Thanks. So this is just a little bit about C2ES. We are now in our 24th year, almost 25 years now, as an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization focused on strong policy and action to address climate change. And our core mission is to secure a safe and stable climate by accelerating the global transition to net zero greenhouse gas emissions and a thriving, just, and resilient economy. We have a long history of bringing together diverse stakeholders and producing accessible content and publications to help promote climate solutions. Next slide, please. Thanks. So this is the challenge that is before us. We, the United States and the world, need to decarbonize economy-wide by 2050. We know a little bit about what the impacts that we're seeing. So we are seeing increasing global temperatures as a result of burning fossil fuels at an accelerating rate since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and that's having a profound effect on climate. Today, we're emitting around 50 billion metric tons, the world, of carbon dioxide equivalent every year, and this is 40% higher than emissions were in 1990 when they were around 35 billion metric tons. So, and this carbon dioxide, once it's in the atmosphere, it takes a long time for it to break down and dissipate, somewhere on the order of 100 to 200 years. We're currently injecting carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere faster than they're breaking down. As a result, atmospheric concentrations are increasing. We're up to around 412 parts per million right now. In pre-industrial levels, we're 275 parts per million. As a result, average global temperatures in 2021 were about 1.1 degrees C higher than in pre-industrial times, or that's around 2 degrees Fahrenheit of temperature we've already seen increase. And the impacts of climate change are here and now. There were 20 in 2021, there were 20 weather climate disaster events with losses exceeding $1 billion. Maryland, with its nearly 3,200 miles of coastline, is particularly vulnerable to the impacts of sea level rise, as well as other climate impacts that we're seeing, like severe droughts and heavy precipitation events. So our time to act and avoid the worst effects of climate change is limited. So it's important that we are establishing decarbonization goals and accelerating those goals over time, which Senator Feldman highlighted in his opening remarks. So many of the scientific studies show that we need to completely decarbonize the US and global economy and achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. This chart shows US energy-related CO2 emissions since 1990, and this is data from the Energy Information Administration. The Annual Energy Outlook reference case are the colored lines on this chart. Since 2005, economy-wide CO2 emissions have fallen by about 17%. Power sector CO2 emissions, which make up around 30% of total energy-related CO2 emissions, have fallen by around 36%. And that's been due to a combination of market and policy forces that have led to this emission decline over the past dozen or so years. But the dashed lines show this, and this is pre-Inflation Reduction Act forecast. So it'll be interesting to see how those lines shift. But those dashed lines show that we're not expecting to see a lot of further emissions declines, whereas the black dotted lines that I've inserted on this graph show where the economy-wide emissions, the orange line at the top, and the power sector, the US power sector, the blue line, need to get to by 2050 in order to achieve that decarbonization. So let's go now to the next slide. So what's the plan? How do we decarbonize the economy? So pathways to deep decarbonization, they generally focus on 3 equally important activities. And the first really is deployment of energy efficiency. We need to be a lot more efficient with our energy, make our buildings, industries, and transportations far more efficient than they currently are. And the next strategy, and this will really be the focus of our conversation today, is on energy supply decarbonization. And this involves decarbonizing the electric power sector. The power sector is really the key. It's the linchpin to getting to net zero. It has to get down to a carbon intensity of 0, and the sooner the better. And that's pretty clear. What's less clear to some is that the power sector is going to have to get a lot bigger than it currently is, because the other sectors are going to be relying on it. And that leads into the final equally important sector, is that we need to promote and use fuel switching, primarily to electric sources. So things like switching from gasoline and diesel-powered vehicles to electric vehicles in the transportation sector, in the building sector, using more things like electric water heaters, electric heat pumps, electric stoves. And then there are some very challenging areas to electrify, like industry, particularly high temperature industry. Heavy duty long haul trucking is very challenging, and long haul aviation as well. And for those end uses, electrification may not be the best solution. So we're considering using things like hydrogen, biofuels, synthetic fuels, renewable natural gas, these kinds of things. So just emphasizing this last point, that electrifying everything may not be the practical solution. We're going to have to look to still having some man-made fuels in the mix as well. And then also the other issue that's not immediately clear is that the power sector is going to have to get much larger than it is. So I didn't say, like, so some of the modeling that's been done shows a power sector that might be realistically, 75% to 100% larger than it currently is today. And it's a very big power sector. So that's a lot of power plants and infrastructure that would need to be built between now and mid-century. So let's go to the next slide. So the opportunities and challenges for decarbonization. So there's a lot of, I pointed out earlier that we have made significant progress, particularly in the power sector. That's the sector where we have made the most progress. There's been a lot of switching. We've had federal research, development, demonstration, and deployment programs on a range of technologies, from solar and batteries to horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing. So that has led to much greater use of natural gas in the power sector, which has displaced a lot of coal. It's also led to huge cost reductions in technology deployments for wind and solar. Additionally, federal tax credits, production tax credits, investment tax credits have incentivized clean technologies, and these have recently been further expanded and bolstered with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which I'm sure will come up during this discussion as well. So that's going to help to accelerate renewable deployment. State policy has continued to help. So many states have electricity portfolio standards. One form of an electricity portfolio standard is a renewable portfolio standards. Over time, states have increased their ambition on these targets, and we've also seen some states develop clean electricity standards, which allow other forms of clean electricity to participate in the standard. Things like large hydro and nuclear power can count toward the state's clean electricity goals. Another factor that's been helpful for decarbonization is companies have set clean energy targets, so that's helping to drive demand and deployment of clean electricity. So arguably, because of federal research and incentives, as well as state and corporate policies, solar costs have dropped dramatically. Deployments are accelerating every year now. We're seeing record solar capacity additions in the US, and that's still forecast for the next really, as far as the forecasts go, solar is going to be the largest source of electricity that's going to be deployed in the United States. The last bit is international targets like those that are set in the United Nations, and the senator alluded to this as well, that the US's latest national target is a 50 to 52% reduction below 2005 levels by 2030. So I guess we have to talk about the other side of the ledger as well, is that there are challenges. I alluded to some of them earlier. Although we have the Inflation Reduction Act and we have these credits in place, we don't have an official mandate we have to get to a certain target other than our NDC, but it's not been codified in Congress, for example, that we have to have a certain emission reduction in the power sector by 2030. That could help to make emission or decarbonization occur more quickly. Other policies like a price on carbon, I alluded to a clean electricity standard that some states are doing now. Those also would help to move the needle. It's by setting explicit mandates. I also talked about that we lack solutions in some sectors and applications, so we need to do a lot of innovation. Innovation takes a long time, so we need to get started on that right away. A couple of other huge challenges that just really need to be pointed out is that there's resistance to transmission or power lines, which are critical to decarbonization, especially renewable projects that are located far from where populations or demand centers are. Getting transmission in place as soon as possible is critical to decarbonizing the power sector. Also, another huge challenge now, like inflation is a challenge in our daily lives. It's also a huge problem with higher commodity prices. We're seeing supply chain disruptions, challenges in procuring critical materials. So for the first time, unfortunately, after years of price decline, solar panels actually became more expensive in the last couple of years. But and people are referring to this phenomenon as greenflation, and whether or not this is just a bump in the road or something longer lasting, we'll have to see. But of course, time is of the essence when we're trying to decarbonize and limit the impacts of climate change. So just on to my last slide now. So I think some of the other panelists are going to talk more specifics on these topics, but I just wanted to highlight them at a very high level. So, states have a lot of choices on decarbonization policies. They can do economy-wide decarbonization policies, or they can do sector-specific, like power sector, the renewable portfolio standard type of approach to decarbonizing. I talked a little bit about carbon pricing and electricity portfolio standards. Tax credits are also another incentive that can be put in place to help get more clean energy deployed sooner. Another thing, it's actually the last bullet point on here is leveraging your existing assets. So some states have, like New York, New Jersey, and Illinois, have decided to maintain and utilize the significant amount of nuclear power that they have in the state, and they've established something called zero emission credits to help maintain that asset or those resources for as long as possible. So in terms of how states do the policies, sometimes it's done through the legislature, so it's a statutory action. Sometimes the governor can set targets. With regard to Maryland, the Climate Solutions Now Act was a legislative act, and then the other thing that we look at in terms of climate ambition are climate action plans. So this is really how does the state operationalize its aspirations to get 60% emissions reductions below 2006 by 2031. So those climate action plans are really crucial. So I think I've put a lot out there, food for thought, and I will pass it back to Senator Feldman now.
Okay, thank you, Doug. That was excellent. We're going to now get a perspective from government. We've got Chris Hoagland from our executive branch of government here in Maryland. He's the director of Air and Radiation Administration at our Maryland Department of the Environment, where he's responsible for implementation management of Maryland's air pollution and radiation protection programs. Prior to that, Chris actually managed MDE's climate change program, which coordinates climate change planning and analysis, supports the work of the Maryland Commission on Climate Change. In fact, I think Chris this morning was doing that endeavor before this conference as well. So Chris, I'll turn it over to you to give a perspective from MDE and government, as that's really an important part. We can pass all kinds of laws and recommendations, but the implementation is so essential for success in this space. So Chris, why don't you take it from here?
Thanks so much, Senator Feldman. Thanks to the Maryland Clean Energy Center for hosting us, and to my fellow panelists. Looking forward to the discussion. As the Senator said, I'm the Director of the Air and Radiation Administration at MDE. In addition to our air pollution regulation and our radiological health programs, we include the climate change program. So we are the part of the state that is tasked with developing the state's plan to achieve its climate change goals. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where we are now and where we need to go statewide for climate change. So next slide, please. So this graph here shows Maryland's statewide greenhouse gas emissions going back to 2005 and then projecting some goals forward through 2031. The blue lines are our inventories. Every 3 years, we take an inventory of all the greenhouse gases in the state, and we publish that. So this is our historical measurement of how much Maryland is emitting. And you can see in that blue line, the number's been going down since 2006. 2006 is the baseline year for the climate change goals in Maryland. It's the year against which all of those goals are set. So we made pretty good progress. Our most recent inventory is 2020. We achieved the goal in 2020, which was from one of our prior climate change laws, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act, that required the state to reduce its emissions by 25% by 2020. What we achieved was about 30%, so that's good news. Going forward, we have very ambitious goals. The graph here shows in orange our old goals. As the senator mentioned, we had older climate change law that established a 40% reduction requirement by 2030. And then the red line is the new goals from the new law passed this year, the Climate Solutions Now Act of 2022, that set a new near-term goal of a 60% reduction by 2031. That goal is the most ambitious of any state in the country. One thing to keep in mind is that Maryland is actually the top state for making progress in reducing greenhouse gas emissions so far. As of the latest study that found that about 41 of the 50 states had reduced emissions since 2005, and the one that had reduced emissions percentage-wise by the most was Maryland. We've had climate change laws for a long time. The first law in Maryland that established statewide greenhouse gas reduction requirements was in 2009. Before that, we had a climate action plan, and we were already meeting with the Maryland Climate Change Commission before it was codified. So Maryland has been doing this for a long time, and that continued persistence and effort has paid off. We are making progress, but as you'll see later, the pace at which we need to move is escalating dramatically. So we have a really tall task to build on our momentum and achieve our new goals. Next slide, please. So a little bit more about where we are so far. A lot of the progress Maryland has seen so far is in the electricity sector. This graph here shows all of the greenhouse gas emissions from electricity generation in Maryland, so all of our power plants. Note, this is not how much electricity we've gotten from these different types of sources. This is the amount of carbon pollution from these different sources. That's why you don't see any clean energy resources on this graph. You'll see the blue area, the dark blue area, is emissions from coal-fired power plants. And you see that has declined dramatically since 2006. That is the primary source of greenhouse gas reductions we've seen, is replacing coal-fired generation with cleaner sources. You can see in the light blue area, that's emissions from natural gas. So there has been some increase as some of the reductions from coal have come from switching to natural gas. But on net, there have been substantial reductions as we've switched from coal to other resources like nothing at all, as we've reduced energy use, and to clean and renewable energy resources. One thing to note about Maryland's climate change rules is that we do include one source of greenhouse gas emissions outside of Maryland, and that's emissions associated with the generation of electricity that occurs outside of Maryland, but for electricity that is consumed within Maryland. In Maryland, we consume more electricity than we produce. We are relatively small geographically, we're relatively densely populated, so that isn't too surprising. And so that's an important factor to consider. So the General Assembly included that under our climate change rules, and that's the orange area on this graph. That's our estimate of how much carbon dioxide is being emitted outside of Maryland in order to provide electricity in Maryland. So overall, really dramatic progress in electricity greenhouse gas reductions that will be increasingly challenging to build upon as we've sort of picked most of the low-hanging fruit from phasing out coal use in Maryland. Next slide, please. This shows our total 2020 greenhouse gas emissions in Maryland broken down by sector. You can see in the largest wedge, the dark blue area, is emissions from transportation. This is primarily carbon dioxide from tailpipes, from all of our passenger vehicles, all of our trucks, large and small, etc. Followed by electricity use, which is now the second largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, followed by direct fuel use in buildings, for example, in furnaces and boilers to heat buildings, followed by a series of other sectors, including waste management, industrial processes, etc. Electricity used to be our highest emitting sector. Back in the day, electricity accounted for the bulk of our greenhouse gas emissions. Because of the dramatic progress we've seen in decarbonizing the electricity system so far, it's no longer the largest sector. But as Doug discussed earlier, it is the hinge around everything else turns. Decarbonizing the electricity system is a prerequisite for decarbonizing the other sectors. Because of the outsized role electrification will play in any reasonable strategy to decarbonize transportation and building energy use. So we have to really keep on pushing electricity sector decarbonization to enable us to achieve economy-wide decarbonization. through electrification, among other strategies. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's a little bit on where we are. Note that I linked earlier to a progress report that we just published that you can browse if you'd like to see information on where we are in other key sectors beyond electricity decarbonization. You can see how we're doing with our, our pace and vehicle electrification, for example. In any case, so now where are we going? The Climate Solutions Now Act of 2022, as we've discussed earlier, set the most ambitious state greenhouse gas goal in the country. We now have a 60% reduction by 2031 to achieve. And then it also established a net zero goal by 2045, consistent with other leadership states. MDE, we have until next June to produce a draft plan for the state to achieve those new goals, and until the end of next year to finalize that plan. We have a lot of prior work that we can build upon with that, as we just published a plan to achieve the old 2030 goals last year. But since those older goals are substantially less ambitious than the new ones, we need to find substantial additional reduction measures beyond our current or prior plan in order to achieve the new goals. Next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay, so this graph is showing the breakdown of greenhouse gas emissions in Maryland by gas, carbon dioxide versus methane versus other greenhouse gases. On the left, you can see our 2006 baseline. In the middle, you can see the latest 2020 values, our 2020 inventory. And on the right, we have a couple of potential future 2031 values. Moving from left to right, we started in 2006 with emissions of slightly more than 120 million metric tons in Maryland. In the middle, in 2020, as I said before, we found we achieved a 30% reduction since 2006. Lots of good progress to build upon. That plan we published last year is on the right, the colorful stacked bar on the right. That's our projection in that plan for 2031. That was called the GGRA plan. Our old climate change was the GGRA, Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act. That by 2031, under our latest math, we think that projection would have gotten us to about 44% reduction. The new target for 2031 under the Climate Solutions Now Act is a 60% reduction by 2031. The gap in tonnage is 19.7 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. That's a lot. That's a lot of ground we need to cover in our next plan. The state needs to cover over the next 9 years. That is especially a challenging number, considering that 44% reduction was not easy, or it will not be easy. We put a lot of actually very ambitious measures in that plan we published last year, very ambitious levels of further electricity decarbonization and renewable energy deployment, primarily really ambitious levels of vehicle electrification, really high adoption of electric vehicles on our fleet, and very ambitious levels of electrification of building systems, right? Installing heat pumps in lieu of furnaces in homes, for example, and a slew of other measures that will be very difficult to achieve. So we need to achieve all of those and then do much more to get to this new target. It's a big task that the state is taking on. Next slide, I'll talk a little bit more. Just a snapshot of one of the sectors, zero carbon electricity generation. This graph here is showing back through 2006, the amount of electricity Maryland produces from zero carbon electricity sources. The dark blue area is nuclear power. This is the Calvert Cliffs Power Plant. The light blue area is hydropower. This is primarily the Conowingo Dam, but also some smaller facilities. And then the orange, sort of the yellow and orange, are renewable resources, solar and wind, going back to 2006. The green bars you see on the right half are the projections from that plan we published last year. And you'll see that we are not currently on track. We were making really substantial progress earlier, 5-6 years ago. We developed a plan to build on that, and we've sort of stalled in the last couple of years as we have not continued to accelerate our pace, in particular solar energy deployment, in ways that we anticipated that we would and that we need to. So you'll see that when you compare those sort of solid green bars, the projections, with the colorful bars, the actuals, we have some ground to make up to get back on track to achieve our old goals. I'll note these green bars are from the plan that we produced last year for the old goals. So we need to do better than that plan to meet our new goals. So a major priority the state faces right now is how do we accelerate renewable energy deployment, especially solar power, to get back on track and then ahead of track to hit our new goals. Next slide, please. And so this is a conundrum that the Department of the Environment is grappling with as we're producing the plan due next year, and as the Maryland Commission on Climate Change is grappling with. As we speak, they're meeting right now to talk about recommendations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. When I left them for this meeting, they were in the thick of deliberating on recommendations specific to accelerating solar energy deployment. And so the conundrum is that we have a very strong policy framework in Maryland. State policies on the electricity sector are quite strong. We have the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which I think we'll talk about a little bit later, which is a carbon regulation for power plants. It sets a declining cap. Maryland and 11 other East Coast states have been implementing that program for 13 years now, and it's made a lot of progress. We have the Renewable Portfolio Standard. As we've discussed earlier, Maryland has updated its Renewable Portfolio Standard many times, as Senator Feldman described. So it is current, it is ambitious, it is binding. And we also have other programs that encourage solar power generation, net metering for small solar facilities like rooftop arrays, community solar pilots, developing new models to deploy solar. But other roadblocks have sort of knocked us off track. There is land use competition for the land that would be devoted to utility scale solar. There is the backlog at the PJM interconnection. PJM is the regional grid manager. And there's the backlog of applications for large projects to connect to the transmission system. And then there are some supply chain constraints that Doug mentioned earlier. The good news is that we have lots of new federal investment coming to help. But we still have to find ways in Maryland to sort of break the logjam and accelerate our renewable energy builds, especially solar. This was a topic of this speaker series, I believe, 2 sessions ago on October 4th. And it's an important topic that we should continue discussing today. Next slide, please. So there's lots more to say about other sectors and other challenges. I offered a little bit specific to clean energy generation. Looking forward to the discussion of all the challenges and opportunities the state faces in that area and others.
Okay, Chris. Well, that was excellent. Next up, we've got sort of an industry perspective. We've got Marie Rinkowski, who is the Senior Manager for Clean Energy Policy at Constellation Energy, where she focuses on the intersection of modeling, analysis, and clean energy policy. Marie, why don't you give us an overview from the perspective of industry, Constellation in particular, but not necessarily limited to Constellation Energy, but Marie, it's all yours.
Thank you, Senator. And thank you to the Clean Energy Center as well for this invitation. And also thank you to the other panelists for setting this up so well, and that we've gotten kind of the national picture and also the Maryland specific picture. So I think I'm going to just focus on a couple of places where our analysis and our work tells us that we can use policy to accelerate decarbonization for Maryland in particular. If you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide, I'll just take a moment at the front to give an introduction to Constellation Energy. You may know us as the company that operates Calvert Cliffs. We have our large nuclear plant down in Lusby, Maryland. We are, as a company, actually the #1 provider of carbon-free 24/7 electricity in the United States. We have a large nuclear fleet outside of Calvert Cliffs. We're also a retail electricity supplier too. And a large portion of our business is commercial and industrial customers. And these customers have their own sustainability goals. Like we've heard about the national goals and Maryland state goals. Well, we get a lot of insight talking to our customers about their own corporate sustainability goals that are going to drive a lot of what I'm going to talk about through this presentation. But first, if you could move to the next slide, I just want to focus a little bit on Maryland. This is a picture of Calvert Cliffs. Like I said, it's in Lusby down in Southern Maryland on the west shore of the Chesapeake Bay. We have about 700 employees. We have paid about $23 million in tax payments in 2021. All of our people down there are very engaged in the local community. We actually won the Regional Manufacturing Institute of Maryland's 2021 People's Choice Award for that. I want to say that the Climate Solutions Now Act is particularly meaningful for us, is this recognizes for the first time that nuclear is an integral part of Maryland's clean energy environment and also Maryland's clean energy future. You guys, we just saw a chart from Chris that actually, stacked up where does Maryland's clean energy come from right now? Where do the carbon-free megawatt hours come from? And a large part of that is Calvert Cliffs. It's the only nuclear plant in Maryland. It supplies approximately 83% of all the carbon-free megawatt hours, and Conowingo, output varies year to year, but that's another 8 to 10%. So we are fully invested in the carbon-free future for Maryland. One more item about Calvert Cliffs. It's a large plant. It's about 1,800 megawatts, and it's actually made up of 2 different units. They were built 2 years apart. The first was built in 1975. And so we have an operating license for the unit from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that runs out to 2034, and then unit 2 a couple years later through 2036. And I mention this because the timelines for anything in the nuclear power industry are very long, and in just a few years, about 5 years or so, we're going to be making the decisions about whether to go back to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and apply for an operating license extension that would allow the plant to continue producing carbon-free electricity for another 20 years. I'm happy to say that this plant is, we're enjoying better financial health right now than we have for a number of years. The Inflation Reduction Act that was passed just a couple months ago includes a nuclear PTC, and this is, quite frankly, this is something to celebrate for the nuclear industry to have some level of revenue certainty all the way out through 2032. It allows us to just change our perspective. So where previously we would be thinking about how can we keep these plants online? How can we keep our employers working? How can we keep Maryland on track to its decarbonization goals? Well, now the story has changed. Now the questions are more, how can we expand? How can we develop these sites into clean energy centers? So we're exploring a number of opportunities for our plants right now, from things like minimizing line losses by bringing large loads on site, to direct air capture of CO2, or to producing zero emissions hydrogen. Nuclear is perfectly suited to many of these options. And we're noting the explosion of attention on hydrogen economies and the hubs that are developing around the country that are really kind of zeroing in on, frankly, billions of money that's being funneled through Department of Energy grant programs. And we want to focus on the opportunity for Maryland to be a part of that. Maryland's a transportation hub for some of the hardest to abate sectors. So including air transportation, marine transportation. I think I saw a question about that in the chat, actually. And there are clean fuels that are based on hydrogen that are ideal for decarbonizing those hard to abate sectors. And that's one of the reasons we're exploring hydrogen production at Calvert Cliffs. Turning back to kind of general clean energy procurement for the electric power sector, though, if you could go to the next slide, all of my other panelists have emphasized how key the electric power sector is for decarbonization as we move demand for energy from some higher emitting sectors to the electric power sector, which is on its way to decarbonizing faster. How we procure clean energy in the electric power sector is evolving and has been evolving. We see on the upper left here a time series of basically how RPS policy has evolved. And this is like nearly 3 decades of policy history at this point. And my point in showing this is just to highlight how adaptable these policies are, and that states are using them to adapt as all the circumstances change. However, the other thing that we really need to note here is what I'm trying to get across with the chart on the right, which is about voluntary procurement. So we're looking here at data on renewable capacity additions. The solid portion of these bars over this period of history, the solid portion of the bars is capacity additions driven solely by RPS programs, and the rest of the bar is capacity additions driven by voluntary procurement from maybe corporate or industrial entities that are interested in, feeding their own sustainability goals. And you can see from the data that this has been a very large part of driving renewable capacity additions for a number of years now. So let's talk about who these voluntary buyers are for a second. I mentioned earlier, Constellation is the #1 retail energy supplier for commercial and industrial customers. These are our customers. We have some familiarity with them and their sustainability goals. They're coming to us. They're asking how, one, how can they understand their emissions impact or the emissions impact of their electricity purchases? And then two, how to most effectively reduce their emissions. And so the answers to that question, they're going to be individual to the company, but a lot of the time, most of the time, we end up at this concept of hourly matching. And quite simply, concept of matching carbon-free electricity to the hourly demand for electricity or the hourly load profile each and every hour of the day. And sorry, why do we think that this is so important? I recognize this is what our customers are asked for. We have centered on this as a solution to reducing their emissions and achieving their corporate sustainability targets. But why do we think this is actually that important? I need to like explain to you why this is. If you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide, please. My goal here is by the end of this presentation to make it clear that not only our customers, but also state programs, Maryland's program in particular, should also evolve towards this 24/7 hourly match. And I want to be completely clear right now, 24/7 hourly matching is not what we have today. Both RPS and a lot of voluntary programs across the country tend to use what we call annual accounting, so that at the end of a year, they acquire and retire sufficient RECs to cover all of the generation or electricity needs for the total 8760 hours in a year. And those RECs, those renewable energy attribute credits, could have been produced at any time. So for instance, they might be buying wind generation that was produced in the wee hours of a March morning, and then using those to cover their electricity demand on like a hot afternoon in August when everybody has their AC blasting and electric demand on the grid is high, and correspondingly, the emissions rate at that time is high. So when you actually line up hour by hour the carbon-free electricity generation with the demand for electricity, you find that when the RPS targets get really high, the RPS program is no longer getting the intended result. So I'm going to illustrate that with this chart that we have here. If we just like run a thought experiment, what if Maryland runs its RPS target up to 100%? Well, if you look at hour by hour, how much of each hour through the course of the year is actually served by carbon-free energy under a 100% RPS scenario on the far right side of that graph, it's really only 74% of the hours that are being served by clean energy. And the deviation starts about 50–60%. The program is like, working as intended to achieve carbon-free goals up until that point. But then after that point, you get some diminishing returns. And so this is the illustration of why it's important not only to actually meet the goals that the state or company wants to meet, but also to achieve a decarbonized, but also reliable grid. So we need to really just kind of acknowledge how the electric power system works by balancing load and demand and supply in any given hour. If we want to maintain a reliable grid, we are going to have to produce reliable clean energy. If you could move on to slide 5, please. The question is, what do we need to put together in order to do this? And I think this slide looks complicated, but the illustration is maybe worth a moment to think this through. So one of the things we need to know is, what is the demand? And the solid line on this chart in the middle is an hourly load curve for about a week's worth of time. And you can see how it goes up and down in the daytime and that goes down lower overnight. we also need to know what carbon-free generation sources are available. So in this just, purely theoretical illustration, we have a number of carbon-free sources, and you can see the blue block at the bottom. That is a firm, clean source. You can think of that as nuclear. It's going to be producing the same amount of generation in every hour of the day. The green blocks are what a wind generation curve could look like. So there are ups and downs. There's also kind of like longer multi-day patterns that reflect the weather patterns. You can see solar generation in the yellow blocks. This is, coming up during the daytime and it's not appearing at all overnight. And as you add up where are the carbon-free sources and compare that to where the load is, there is a section that still needs to be filled in. So we see that this purple section, this is additional clean section, is going to have to come from someplace. And quite frankly, that's going to be the marginal supply source that's going to set a price for a 24/7 product. And I go through all of this because one of the things that is extremely important to our customers and will be extremely important for compliance in the future is because you need to have an hourly audit trail. This data is important. Our customers need to be able to demonstrate that and report that their carbon-free electricity is, detailed and auditable. And so we put together the tools that, assemble all of the hourly data and provide a auditable, reportable 24/7 matched electricity product for our customers. If you could go to the final slide, I'd love to end on a high note. And the nice thing to say here is that we absolutely have the tools to do this. Our customers are requesting it. We are working on the partnerships to implement every step along the way. And we see that there are governments, there are ISOs that are acknowledging the need for 24/7 hourly matching, both in terms of meeting the decarbonization goals, but also preserving a reliable electricity supply. There are SEC regulations that are proposed that include decarbonization and hourly matching audit trails. The US government has a procurement out, and even the Department of Energy is looking at this as they're putting together clean hydrogen standards. Other states, California and Washington, also have some hourly components to some of their procurement requirements. And we think that Maryland has a major opportunity here as well. The Climate Solutions Now Act opened this door. So the state of Maryland was directed to begin procuring 75% of the electricity supply for state facilities from clean sources. And so we think 75% is a fairly high number. You are far on the right of that graph that I showed that a straight RPS has some diminishing returns. And Maryland needs to institute an hourly match requirement here to procure 24/7 matching supply for either all or a portion of that facility load. This puts Maryland out there as a first to market leader, proving out this concept for other states and also for customers in general. As the more common this 24/7 product becomes, the sooner it's available for every resident throughout the state. I'm going to leave it there because I think I've gone a little over my time, but I do want to again thank the Maryland Clean Energy Center for this opportunity, and I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Hey, thank you, Marie. That was great. And so we got about 25 minutes left. Maybe we can throw some questions in the mix, either from the audience or from me. Marie, why don't we start with you? I'm going to throw a question back at you, and then I'm going to go to Chris with a question, and then maybe to Doug, and I'll look through the Q&A and see if there's some questions from the audience. But on the issue of nuclear, because we started with a poll that showed support for nuclear playing a role here, it has to do with the economics. I know you mentioned Inflation Reduction Act, but when I happened to, there were some folks on the call here today. Actually, I went to France and I toured nuclear power plants in France for about a week. Those are, largely government-owned facilities. I think Korea has a similar deal. But back here in the United States, we're part of the PJM grid and all that. Some folks have floated ideas like that if in the area of nuclear, that we economically, to make it work, maybe we should create something like a port authority or some kind of regional collaboration or government ownership or whatever. Could you speak a little bit to that? Because you touched how important Calvert Cliffs is, and that, you know, there may be some new licensing. The economics of nuclear in the United States, to actually, you know, to the extent you think nuclear should play a larger role. And I should say the Southern States Energy Board, I got a whole lesson on small modular reactor technology and emerging technologies. So Maria, why don't we start with you on that? And if Chris or Doug want to weigh in as well, and then I've got a couple of questions maybe for Chris and Doug specific. But Maria, why don't we start with nuclear power? That's where we started the day.
Sure, absolutely. So like many of the audience members, I was happy to see that in that initial poll, there's some pretty broad agreement that nuclear has to be part of the decarbonization scenario going forward. And when you look at the data that Chris presented on what Maryland is producing right now, it's just pretty hard to ignore. And so again, I said this before, but we're very happy that the Climate Solutions Now Act really just like gave that recognition. And so the next step then is where can we move forward? I mentioned that the Inflation Reduction Act includes a nuclear PTC, and Doug talked also earlier about how there are a number of states that have produced some sort of emissions credit, either a ZEC or a CMC, a procurement basically of their in-state nuclear for their in-state customers. And we worked hard with both the states and the federal legislature in making sure that the IRA crafted language so those two were never in conflict with each other. And you mentioned that the nuclear PTC does sunset in 2032. A lot of the decarbonization scenario work that I've done on behalf of the company has been focused on, once we get to the end of that sort of timeline, or even just in any long-term decarbonization scenario, what are the revenue streams available to, to carbon-free power? And there's been a long period of time where, for instance, the wind and solar industries, when they were nascent, they were, fairly benefited by the existence of, the wind and solar PTC and ITC. I think actually one of the highlights of the Inflation Reduction Act is the evolution of those tax credits away from fuel specific and towards technology neutral. So where previously the PTC and ITC, they spelled out which technologies were eligible. Starting in 2024, there's going to be a technology neutral PTC and ITC that's available to any technology producing carbon-free electricity. We don't know what all of those technologies will be and what's really going to come to the forefront in the next few years. I do think that small modular reactors are going to be part of that. Quite frankly, like nuclear power plants in general, they are expensive. There are less expensive options when it comes to building something new. However, when it comes to building something new, the cost of like an entire full-scale light water reactor is high. And maybe it's so high that it's out of reach for a lot of entities in the near future. But one of our interests as Constellation is in these small SMRs. And maybe there's something like on the order of a couple hundred megawatts rather than the full 1,800 megawatts at Calvert Cliffs. And so these SMRs then can be built for a smaller portion of the cost of a full-scale plant, but still putting out reliable power, because really that's the key. That's what you get out of nuclear generation. With nuclear, quite simply, we know that they're going to be there. We know that they're going to reliably produce megawatt hours every hour. It's not dependent on the weather. And I know this question is very nuclear focused, but as Doug and Chris laid out, we're going to need every single carbon-free resource out there. We just also need to acknowledge that the electricity grid works by matching supply to demand, and there's minimal storage. And so the timing of when those carbon-free megawatt hours show up, it really does matter. Nuclear is a reliable source of electricity, and that's why we're really kind of focusing on the development of the 24/7 hourly matching. It's technology neutral, but it also shifts the emphasis from just make carbon-free megawatt hours happen to make them happen when they're needed. And developing that market, I think, is kind of the key to decarbonization while maintaining reliability.
Okay, and before I maybe go to a specific question for Chris and one for Doug, do you guys have anything you want to weigh in on what you heard Marie say with respect to the role of nuclear moving forward, at least in our state or region or PJM grid, et cetera? Chris, Doug, any thoughts?
Sure. I'd like to jump in. I mean, you saw, I'll use Chris's graph because it's a good graph. It shows what a large chunk of the zero emission electricity is coming from Calvert Cliffs. So if that were somehow to go away, which, you know, California lost a plant that was that size. New York lost a plant that was that size. It's represents a substantial portion of Maryland's electricity. It's 40% of Maryland's electricity total and 80% of Maryland's zero emission. So if we were to lose that, there would be serious backsliding on emission reduction, and Chris's other chart about Maryland achieving its 2020 goal would be seriously impinged upon. And renewables are great, and I think that there are, and we'll probably get to this on other questions, but they are limited by things like the wind and the sun resource that's available. So it's hard to replicate for Maryland what's happening in Arizona and California and the Southwest. It's hard to replicate for wind, onshore wind at least, what's happening in Texas and the Great Plains, where they have such an amazing wind resource. Maryland's best renewable option is without a doubt offshore wind. And it should attempt to go big on that, because I believe that a diverse zero emission electricity system offers a lot of security. You don't want to just have all nuclear or all solar. The more options that you have, the better it is for managing the reliability and security of the electricity system. Solar is a great resource, but it's limited in Maryland, and I think that Maryland should pursue the solar option as strongly as it can. Which is why the small modular reactor option makes a lot of sense as well, because it has a very small footprint, and it's very energy dense, so you can get a couple hundred megawatts or in a very small area with having a minimal impact on land use.
Okay. Hey, Chris, maybe just to switch gears real quick, I get a lot of questions over time about, you actually referenced earlier RGGI, and Maryland's role in this 11 states, I guess now, sort of compact of sorts. So I got some questions about, I'll throw one or two in on that front. What is Maryland looking for with respect to a RGGI program review? Will Maryland push for RGGI to lower the program emissions cap to 0 by 2040? Is that something the other states in RGGI are considering? Are we considering expanding cap and trade when it comes to carbon pricing to help reduce emissions in sectors like industry and transportation within the RGGI construct? Is that something that we're looking at as a state as we review our role in RGGI, or what other states are doing? Chris?
Sure, thank you. Good question. Yeah, RGGI has been a very important program in the state for the last 13 years. It's responsible for a lot of the electricity sector reductions that we've seen, both because it regulates the carbon dioxide in power plants and requires it to go down, and also because it provides funding for other clean energy programs like states' incentives for solar power and electric vehicles, et cetera. So RGGI is in program review right now. The states have convened program review. And under the current timeline, we're planning on doing sort of policy deliberations in earnest with stakeholders next year. We're still in sort of more of a listening mode. But yes, Maryland is looking to come out of that program review with a stronger RGGI program. In the plan that we published last year, we included a measure where we would go into program review and say we should, adjust the RGGI cap to be consistent with states' clean energy goals. And in Maryland, that meant in that plan, zero carbon electricity by no later than 2040. So it is our goal to work with the other RGGI states. RGGI is a collaborative program, so Maryland can't tell everybody else what to do. But we are coming into that program review hoping to see a stronger program come out the other end that is consistent with our zero carbon electricity goals.
Okay. Hey, Doug, maybe kind of turning to you a little bit. I mean, one question also comes up: how do we measure the impact of some of these policies? Because there was a question I think I saw in the Q&A dealing with carbon reduction figures and what's included, what's not. I think a gentleman mentioned something about methane gas, et cetera. Just for lay folks or not lay folks, do we do a good job of measuring those impacts? I mean, are they accurate measurements so that we can know if these policies are succeeding, or can they be massaged to make them look better than they really are? That kind of thing. Doug, you might be maybe in a position to, because you do a lot of modeling and all this kind of stuff, to weigh in.
Yeah, ultimately, I'd say the proof is in the inventory, right? So when you set a target and then you're measuring, there's usually a bit of a lag in terms of what state or national greenhouse gas inventory can show. And you have to just measure in every sector and then there are, the EIA or the EPA does it in a couple different ways. They do it by point sources, so a bottom-up approach, or just kind of taking a top-down approach to measuring what your emissions are in various sectors. So benchmarking is really important in the building sector, to understand what level or how inefficient your building stock is. And I know that Maryland's Climate Solutions Now Act is looking at the building or tackling the issues with the building sector. We have a lot of existing buildings that are not efficient, and there are things we can do to improve building envelope in terms of how energy is leaking out of a building, for example, or how a building is supplied with energy, either passively, from just getting sunlight and having to use less electricity, or using, there's no reason why a large building with a flat roof should not have solar panels on it. I mean, I'm a firm believer that that's like something that we should really strive for, to utilize all the available roof space that we have as soon as we can. There's some higher level things that I alluded to about in my talk initially about how a policy is strong policy versus weak policy. When a state does a legislative act, that's a lot better than when a governor just signs an executive order and says this is our new emissions goal. There's not a lot of strength behind that. A new administration comes in, and then those policies are not necessarily carried through. So I think that's very important to look at. States that are doing economy-wide policies is much better than states just tackling the electricity sector, because there's synergies between, we're finding, like hydrogen can be used in the power sector, and it can be very important tool for decarbonizing heavy-duty long-haul trucking in the state of Maryland, where you see like that's the biggest piece of the pie now, and those are the emissions that are probably going to be where the hard work is going to come, that Chris alluded to.
Okay, thanks, Doug. Here's maybe a question for any one of the panelists. So the last, I think it's been mentioned that we've had every year an evolving. I mean, I had the 2019 Clean Energy Jobs Act, but we've been playing with our RPS program for almost every session. There's tweaks and changes. Similarly, we just passed this major bill, the Climate Solutions Now bill, that's been referenced several times. And I think, as I mentioned at the outset, I think the building folks may come in with some pushback on that. If you on those, maybe our current RPS program and the Climate Solutions Bill from 2022, if you were to basically, kind of give some suggestions or recommendations on how those two bodies of law that we're currently dealing with moving forward, are there some things that you can think of that would be improvements or some changes, or where they come up short, or where you think maybe they do it right? Just to give the audience maybe some sense of either one or both of those pieces of legislation that have passed this 4-year term, the 2019 Clean Energy Jobs Act and the 2022 bill, Climate Solutions Now bill. Any thoughts on those two bills, or how it impacts, Marie, your industry and that kind of thing? I think that'd be sort of just to put it out there for any of the three of you.
Maybe I'll start. As a lowly bureaucrat, I do not tell the General Assembly what to do, but I'll note that the Climate Solution Now Act set this big, new, really ambitious goal, and we're getting started on developing the plan. But one thing we want to be clear about from the department's perspective is that no one should be waiting for our plan due next year to achieve the 2031 goal, because we know that there are a whole bunch of things that we've identified we need to do and we haven't done yet. And so, for example, we know we need to put programs in place for building electrification to provide incentives for, the homeowners to switch to heat pumps. We haven't done that yet. And don't wait for MDE's plan next year to tell us whether or not we should do that. MDE's plan next year is going to tell us we should do that, right? There's no way we can meet our goals without building electrification. So that's one item the department's been working with the Commission on Climate Change this year, is to identify sort of near-term actions we know we need to take, that we don't need to wait for any further planning processes, and we don't need to wait for, the 2024 session, for example, to start acting on. And some of the priority areas, we'll see that the Commission is still developing its recommendations, but some of the priority areas in discussion this year have been what we talked about earlier: accelerating solar energy deployment, but also accelerating electric vehicle adoption, and building electrification, heat pump adoption. Those are some really top priorities that the state should move on now, rather than waiting for additional planning processes that the department's working through that'll take some time.
Marie, Doug, any thoughts on those two big bodies of law that we're dealing with and trying to continue to move forward, improve? Again, there are going to be bills on both those laws, I think, in the 2023 session.
All right, I'll jump in. I'll try to keep it short. I know I talk a lot. You mentioned the RPS, and I think very early on in this conversation, Doug described how a lot of state goals they're transforming over time, right? So something that started out as an RPS is developing into a clean energy standard. And I think Maryland has an opportunity to move the recognition of nuclear and hydro as electricity sources that are carbon free kind of into a more planned out program. I'll say that first. The second aspect of this, I think, is to consider creating a partial requirement or a carve out for 24/7 hourly matched energy that lives within a clean energy standard. And the focus there then is to make sure that Maryland is incentivizing not just carbon-free generation, but reliable carbon-free generation. And the last thing I'll note, because I've been hoping for a chance to throw this in here, is that we've talked a lot about economy-wide decarbonization and laid out some of the more challenging sectors there that are really hard to abate. I want to throw again the idea that hydrogen is kind of described as like a Swiss Army knife of decarbonization, and that Maryland has a lot of opportunities here with the transportation industry in particular. And while the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure bill, there are large kind of federal monies that are out there potentially to develop hydrogen hubs. And we see like groups all over the country that are forming to kind of link up participants throughout the hydrogen industry locally. And for instance, Constellation is part of Connected DMV, for example. The IRA includes a clean hydrogen production tax credit, so that handles the production side of the equation. But what is really missing, and this is a place where Maryland could jump in, is an end user hydrogen consumption tax credit. So a picture like that kind of ties up with a bow a very complete hydrogen hub proposal that could bring some of those Department of Energy dollars towards Maryland and grow the economy while decarbonizing the economy.
Hey, Doug, any thought? And I see Kathy's popped back in, so that might be a signal that we're supposed to bring this to some closure over the next couple of minutes here. But Doug, any thoughts before I maybe let Kathy weigh in?
Yeah, apologies on that. I was responding to some of the audience questions in the chat, so I'll pass on responding to that. Thanks.
Okay, Kathy, since you're on camera here, did you want to weigh in on here with our 3 minutes left?
No, I think you had 3 minutes left. I just wanted to let you know that we really are grateful for everyone's contribution today. This topic is so timely and so important. Clearly, Senator, as you tee up for a coming session and future discussions, we've seen some impactful information today. So I'm grateful to our panelists and to you for moderating. We want to invite everybody to join us for our upcoming session next week on October 25th. We have 2 sessions. We have a morning session on solutions to achieve building energy performance standards, which is clearly important. And then on the 25th in the afternoon, we have a session on master energy plan design and implementation for facility maintenance and operation. So please plan to join us for that. I just want to remind all our audience that we could not get to all the questions today. There was just a barrage of great discussion happening in the chat and in the Q&A. The recordings from this series will be posted online shortly at www.mdcleanenergy.org/speaker series. As we approach the end of the series, we hope you'll join us, and we thank our panelists and our moderator again for their time today. Thanks, everyone.